Hi guys, thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to take an Ender 3 Pro and we're going to convert it to direct drive using the Basaraba Innovations DDE3 conversion kit for the Ender 3. So the DDE3 kit is very much like the kits for the other similar platforms that use the same X carriage here. So that would be like the CR10. I think one of the main differences is just the length of the extension cable for it, since the CR10 is obviously a larger build volume than an Ender 3. I'm just going to open the package. Everything that you need for installation aside from tools is included in the kit. So as I just mentioned, there's an extension cable. This is for the extruder motor, since we're relocating it from this back bracket here onto the hot end assembly. So we're gonna need some extra length. There's a little wire loom to try to tidy everything up once we're done. Some zip ties. All the hardware that you'll need to bolt it on. So there's some really long M3 screws here. There's also a few 3D printed parts. These are brackets usually used, most of them are used for zip tying the wires kind of out of the way or to hold them stationary. There's also a flat piece here. This is a spacer that will space the motor away from the assembly a little bit, just to make sure that everything's in alignment. And then the main component here is a machined aluminum bracket. This replaces the stock bracket that is used for the X carriage. And it has a little piece that's extended up here, and that's where the motor itself bolts onto. So that's nice. There are, printed versions of this, but this is a sturdy assembly. So for the install, I haven't done one of these myself, so I'm going to follow the instructions that are provided with the kit, and wherever I'm not following the instructions, I'll point that out because I may want to try to take a shortcut or do something slightly differently. But you should be able to follow the instructions verbatim and get this thing installed. So I've already gone over the contents included in the kit. The first thing that they say to do is to, if it's assembled, to rotate your Z stepper motor until the entire X gantry here comes right off the top. I think they're doing that to make it easier to work on the components so that you could have everything kind of off the printer. I'm not going to do that. I'll just unbolt the extruder assembly from here. I'll remove the bottom wheel from the X carriage and remove the carriage from the 2020 entirely, as well as removing the belt. So I'll start with this assembly here. There's just two screws. As you may already know, you may have seen us do this many times in other videos. We're going to remove the fan shroud from the X carriage. And we're going to want to put a wrench on this nut here, and we're going to unbolt it from the back and remove the bottom wheel from the assembly. So now, there's basically nothing holding this on except for the belt. You can usually slide the belt out through the grooves in the X carriage, just push them backwards. There's little ferrules that are pinched onto the ends, so you can just push on them backwards. And then there's nothing holding this on there anymore. To make that easier, you can release these two screws a little bit and push this in to release all the tension on the belt, which will make pushing those out easier. So I've got that off. We may as well go ahead and remove everything from here because we're not going to be using this bracket anymore. So just do the same process, unbolt the rest of the wheels. To get to this wheel over here, we're gonna have to remove the hot end. Usually you'll have a tough time pulling the ptfe out of the hot end, so I'll do that off the printer. So just remove these two bolts and the hot end will come free. So we're done with this plate. We're gonna throw it off to the side. Just to help us keep track of all the parts we've taken off, and because the instructions say so, we're going to bolt the top two wheels back onto the new carriage. We'll leave the bottom one off because we're going to have to kind of slide it on the same way we took it off. So with the little fingers facing backwards so that they can hold onto the belt, we're going to feed through the bolts for the top two like this. I'll do one at a time. And you need to put the little aluminum spacer in between, and then the nut on the back. So with those wheels back on, you can now see why he had you take the unit off. There's not as much clearance between these wheels and these fingers as the original one had, so you can't slide that on. Now you could probably loosen these up and get away with it. But part of the instructions did say to remove this tensioner entirely. These two screws are just hammer nuts, so just loosen them. You don't have to totally unscrew them, and that will slide right off. That will allow us to slide this unit there we go, on the end like that. So we'll leave that there for now. We need to get the ptfe tube out of the hot end. So pressing down on this collar should release it, but they're usually hard to get out. It's probably going to be easier to just unscrew this collar from the hot end. And now you should be able to press down on that and remove it from the ptfe. There we go. So the ptfe will be a little bit chewed up there, but don't worry. That's not going to affect us because we're not going to be Bowden anymore. We're going to be direct drive, and we only need a very small portion of ptfe that he includes in the kit. Only because I have it available, I have a scrap piece of Capricorn XS that I'm going to use, which will allow me to run my hot end at slightly higher temperatures than your average ptfe. So we can take off the extruder mechanism at the back here. The extruder is just held on with 4 screws. To start, we're going to have to remove the tension off the spring that's holding this lever there. Using a wrench or pair of pliers or something, pull the spring out. There we go. And now we can move this and get access to the screw that's underneath the lever. So I've loosened the 3 screws, and now the screw that goes through the pivot point of the lever, I need to hold the motor. I'm actually going to unplug it too. I need to hold that because that would drop, and if you have like a glass bed or something, that could crack it. And then I'm just going to cut the zip ties that are holding the ptfe tube to the wiring here, and then we'll be able to remove the extruder assembly, the lever assembly. Okay, so I've pulled this off exactly as it was on the printer. It's still got all the mounting hardware there. I'm just going to put that down because I think we're going to reuse some of that, except for the ptfe, as I mentioned. And I know that the wiring is going to come over the front here now, so I'm just going to relocate that like that. And then I'll refer back to the instructions again. So now we're going to assemble the new extruder assembly. We'll take the old extruder along with the original brass feeder gear. We will need the spacer here that I mentioned when we unpackaged this. We'll need the original lever assembly, the 3D printed bracket that looks like this, and that should be it. I've got both parts of the lever assembly, the base plate as well as the lever itself, and the spring that I took out is there. So the instructions tell us to take the extruder motor with the wire connection facing the left of us and place it down on the table. We will take the flat little spacer here and drop that on top. And then the original lever assembly, in my case I still have the 3 bolts, with the connector for the Bowden tube facing away from us, and place that on top as well. And then it says just take 2 of the screws. So facing away from me, I'm going to take the top right, make sure that that's fed down through and screwing into the motor body. And then the little recessed screw here on the bottom left, I'm going to tighten that one. That kind of just squares that up to the motor. So just to clarify, this bolt here, I just inserted it to help kind of guide so that all the holes will be lined up. This is not tight. I used this bolt, I tightened this bolt up, and that aligns everything. And then we're going to remove this bolt, leaving only the recessed bolt in the corner there. So now we're ready to install the tension spring and the arm. So the tension spring, there's a little perch there for it. And then we should be able to kind of shimmy the arm on there. It's kind of difficult for me to do this and show you. So I've got the spring in, and then this guy with a little bit of coercing. And you want to make sure that you're not cross-threading that. There we go. So do not over-tighten this screw here, or it'll make your lever kind of bind. So this should move freely. There's lots of tension on that. So I've removed the new X carriage off the 2020 rail. I previously slid it on there to make sure we're going to be able to get it on without removing the whole assembly. But this part's definitely going to be a lot easier if it's off the machine. So with the wheels facing away from you, what we're going to do is take this little spacer that has a cutout here, and that cutout is for this little notch where the ptfe connects into that connector. So we're going to slide that on there to give us a flat surface to mate the two of these together. So these two holes that are on this little raised portion of the new carriage, this is going to bolt onto there with the outlet facing down in this case, because this will be riding like this. So with the outlet facing towards here. And there are M3 screws included in the kit. I believe they're 20mm M3 screws. And those should fit down through there and bolt them into the extruder motor body. Included in the kit as well is a new push connect fitting for the ptfe tube into the hot end. Hot end is still connected to our wire here. So we're going to screw this in and just leave it about 2 rotations loose. This is so that we can feed the ptfe in, and then we will tighten down this fitting, which will put pressure against the nozzle to make sure that the ptfe is firmly seated against the nozzle. As I said, I'm using a piece of Capricorn. I'm going to cut it to exactly the same length as the supplied section of ptfe. And to make sure that the ends are cut square, I'm going to use the Capricorn tube cutters. There we go. Okay. And then we will insert this all the way till it bottoms out, and then using the wrench, tighten those last two turns. And the little release lever on the coupler here should be popped out because there's a lot of tension against it because of those two last rotations tightening the coupler. So at this point, we're going to take the original hot end and we're going to bolt it onto the new X carriage. These are the 2 holes that are threaded or are tapped for the screws, and that gets inserted in there. We do have to remove this stock coupler that was in here. And there's also a spacer that will go between this aluminum heatsink and the back plate that bumps it out by a couple more millimeters. As a result, we can't use the original screws, so we'll just take the lock washers off the original screws and install them on the slightly longer M3 bolts that are provided. And then using these, we'll attach the heatsink through the spacer and into the back plate here. So now we need to remove the top left screw in the back of the extruder stepper motor here. It's a Phillips head, make sure you don't strip it. Sometimes these can be kind of hard to get out. And we're going to place this little bracket onto it with the little nub here beside it like that. So it should be flush on the side facing you. The nub is kind of in line with this metal nub on the motor itself. And then use one of the long M3 bolts that were included and bolt that back on. So now we can slide this back onto the X rail here. I am going to leave the fan shroud disconnected. It'll make getting at the bottom wheel a little bit easier. Slide it on the end, making sure that the belt stays under the wheels. And we can slide the belt back into those little fingers, like the same way we took it out beforehand. Since we've removed the tensioner on the right side there, it should be pretty easy to slide them back in. And now we'll reconnect the bottom wheel here. Make sure that when you're assembling this, you have the eccentric nut, and this flange is to go in through the back of the plate. So it would be attached to your wheel and bolt like that. So now that I've got the bottom wheel bolted back on, I've adjusted the eccentric nut to make sure that there's good tension on the rail, and we can now reattach the original fan shroud like that. There we go. And we may as well add the tensioner back on at this point, so we can make sure that the belt is staying connected to those little fingers. This one's already fallen off again. You want to make sure that both of the hammer nuts have rotated so that they're engaged. Release all the tension off of that. So bring it this way as far as you can. And let's make sure we're still on the teeth. There's a lot less clearance between the rail and those little fingers on this bracket, so it's a little bit trickier to get that in there. Once that's in, we'll press outward on this tensioning bracket and then tighten it. So this wire is basically going to go like this now. And as I mentioned earlier, we have an extension for the extruder motor, since it's now a little bit further away. So let's just connect that extension here and to the motor. And then let's start to tidy up this wiring a little bit. So in order to tidy up some of the wiring, there's a couple kind of wiring brackets that we have that we can run zip ties through these little holes. One of them is going to connect onto here to kind of hold this over to the side. We'll remove the QR sticker to reveal the bolts that hold this. And so we're going to bolt this on to the edge here. We'll have to remove these two bolts and we'll replace them with the longer ones included in the kit. And then the other bracket like that goes on the Z motor. And for this one, the screws we're going to use are actually the original screws that came out of the hot end that attached it to the original X carriage. So we should have two of those. And this bracket is going to sit on top of the Z motor like that. And then we should be able to just bolt down into the two holes on the back side of the stepper motor. So once you've screwed that in, you'll notice that the screws kind of bottom out before they actually put any pressure on there. So you could use shorter screws. This is really just to hold the wires kind of out of the way. Or you could maybe even print a different bracket, but that's how it's meant to be installed. And now we'd be able to use these clips to hold the wires off to the side here. So we can bundle those like that. And we've got pre-existing zip ties here we can get rid of. Just gonna put that loosely on there for now. Make sure that there's enough travel for it to get to the other side. And And then the same thing at the back. Pull the slack up from the control box and zip tie it using the bracket, which we keep it kind of taut between the bracket and the control box, which will make sure that the bed doesn't catch on the wires. So the one wiring bracket that we haven't used is this one that we attached to the motor there. The two of these wires are going to get bundled together using a little kind of split loom. It's not exactly split loom, it's called something else. It's like a plastic coil that will wrap around the two to make them look to be one. So this kind of coiled plastic, we'll start wrapping it around. Once you get it started, it's a lot easier. There. You just kind of spin it and you're doing kind of like a corkscrew around the two wires. So I've got that all wrapped now, and I've kind of tightened the zip tie that I had here over top of this wrap to just hold that kind of tight there. Do the same over here. So that has enough slack to reach both edges. And there's going to be lots here for us to reach the top of the Z. So we're just about done. One of the last things we're going to do is move the spool holder. So because it's direct drive, it makes no sense to have the filament come off the side anymore. So we're going to rotate this 90 degrees and allow the filament to kind of roll right over the top. So in the picture, it shows the filament kind of like this. I guess you could also have it this way. I'm a little bit concerned that there's only one bolt holding this in and that this maybe over time would bend. But for now, there'll just be one holding that in there. I was just making sure that the hammer nut fully rotated in that groove to make sure that it's making good contact. And I'll remove the unused bolt from the back. So now you can see that the wires aren't going to get caught by the bed or by the leveling wheels. They're spread over to the side, and we will probably want to re-level our bed. Obviously, making any kind of change like this, you should probably go through that process. And another thing that I would highly recommend is to calibrate your E-steps to make sure that you are extruding the amount of plastic you're telling it to. A simple way of doing that is to measure up your filament, hopefully a light colored filament, it's easier to mark on, and mark it with like a Sharpie. So measure with your calipers up from here, say 120 millimeters, mark it, tell the printer to extrude 100 millimeters. You can either do that through the LCD or sending it a G-code command to do so. You will do that fully up to temperature with whatever material you're running. So if I'm running PLA, I'll run it a little extra hot to make sure there's like no resistance. So let's say I'm running it at 230 or something. I'm extruding that 100 millimeters, and then I'll measure when it's done. And using a little bit of quick math that we'll show somewhere up here, you can calculate the difference in percentage from your current E-steps to what they should be based on what you measured. You'll put that into the firmware, either via G-code and saving it with M500, or you can add it to your start script if you're something on like a stock Ender 3 where you can't write to the EEPROM. You can add the G-code into your start script, and I'll include examples of that in the description. The other major change that you're going to make to your slicing settings is on your retraction. So one of the major benefits of going direct drive is that you no longer need 5, 6, even 7 millimeters of retraction. Actually, doing so will probably result in a jam. Here, we can get away with 1 millimeter, 0.8 even. I mean, I could run probably very similar settings that I use on something like my Titan Aero, only I was able to accomplish a very similar end result at a much more affordable price. So somewhere around 0.8 or 1 millimeter might be a good starting point for PLA. And you should probably print a retraction test or stringing test, depending on what they're called. Just 2 towers and move between them to make sure that your retraction settings are set well enough that you're not stringing in between 2 movements. And you may need to change that retraction a little bit for oozier filaments. So if you're running something like a nylon or even a PETG, you may need slightly higher retraction, but nowhere near the original 6 millimeters. Hopefully you found that useful, and now you too can convert your Ender 3 or any of the CR10 series printers with the appropriate kit into a direct drive. Remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment down below. Let me know what else you'd like to see, or if you have any questions about this video or any of the other videos you've seen on the channel. Thanks for watching.